It is my great pleasure today to be joined by Gary Sheng, who is a US-based technology and civic entrepreneur dedicated to building tools, systems, and movements that accelerate human and planetary flourishing. Gary co-founded Civics Unplugged and DreamDAO, which is training Gen Z civic innovators, and is currently focused on building hyperlocal civic empowerment projects around the US. He's also someone that I've had a bunch of interesting conversations with over the past months now, I guess, and I find to be an extremely thoughtful and inspiring individual. So, Gary, how are you doing today?
Thank you for the kind words, Stephen. I feel the same about you. I've been in the Web3 space for the last half year or so, and there are a few people that I feel more aligned with than yourself. So it's an honor to be on this podcast, and I think you know that we have a lot of cool stuff to jam on today.
Yeah, for sure. So, the question that I'm planning to ask all of the guests first is what does Lunarpunk mean to you, given the title of this podcast, Lunarpunk Dreams?
So I looked up a definition of it before we got on this call, and I'm sure different people have different definitions, but solarpunk is so much about a sort of like global vision for humanity's future,
Mm-hmm.
very humanity level focused, I think. Not everyone views it that way, but I think lunar punk invites us to think about our role as an individual in the bigger picture.
Mm.
And I think it also, at least to me, makes me think about the dark side of market cycles and humanity, and how we need to design with all of that in mind. We're talking right now post crash after crash of the crypto markets, and it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. I think it's been a sobering experience. I think all of us had weird feelings about how people were acting over the last, year plus. But
What are you getting at by weird feelings there?
well, I mean, you wonder like how legitimate these like super hyped up crypto projects are,
Mm-hmm.
and most, if not, yeah, most of these projects are are vapor.
Mm-hmm.
They and they lose people a ton of money, like ordinary people that are just trying to create a better future for themselves. Maybe a lot of it is greed related, but a lot of it is just security related, right? We have
Mm.
stable coins, quote unquote stable coins, that collapsed. And so a lot goes through my head, like what different words mean to people now. What does Web3 mean to people post all these
Mm.
collapses, post this like kind of awakening around what the state of the technology is?
Maybe I can ask you, what do you want it to mean?
I'm one person. I don't think I have the ability to change it, or I'm not sure if I do, the meaning of it. But Web3, if you didn't know that it was so associated with blockchain and cryptocurrency, you might think that it just means the set of technologies and philosophies that take internet technologies and internet culture to the next level so that humanity has a bright future.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are able to criticize Web 2 for hypercentralization, exploitation of our data, surveillance capitalism. But I don't think that all the people that claim to identify as part of Web 3, I don't think we've articulated a better path forward. And I think the easiest thing to do is to create self-serving narratives
Mm-hmm.
where this new technology that's really sexy, that's raising a ton of venture capital money, is the future, right? This is a very, even if there's not cynical intentions, it is a convenient thing for a VC to propagate, right? It's a convenient meme, right? That, all this like old stuff that didn't have blockchain is
Hmm.
not the future.
Hmm.
All the stuff with blockchain is the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's plenty of technologies, right? Like, what Web3 applications don't depend in some way on open source software?
Hmm.
That's not Web3. And where does civic tech fit into Web3? Where is that part of the conversation? Or like
Right.
regenerative technology, regenerative practices.
Yeah.
So um,
So if we were to expand our notion of Web3 beyond simply blockchain technology, then what other kinds of technologies can you imagine be included in Web3? Or would you like to see kind of included when people speak of Web3?
I think step one is getting more clear on what success looks like, or maybe changing the definition of what success looks like. Success does not mean that everyone is using a blockchain application necessarily, right? That might be what happens, maybe because it's useful. I don't know. But I think success for Web3 has more to do with, or let's just say the future of the internet, like the future of the internet will have been successful, or the next generation of it will have been more successful if we're able to solve problems that we weren't able to solve with the previous generation of technologies and ways of using it and thinking about the world and thinking about each other. So success looks like a more stable and resilient world where people are not worried about their wealth being evaporated uh, from just sitting there, and they're not worried about their identity being stolen and exploited. They're not worried they're excited about how technology is being used to protect and restore natural ecosystems, create maybe even new ecosystems, because we've gotten so good at terraforming Earth. And if someone else has a better term for the technology that does all this, or like a way to encapsulate it, I'm super open to that. Right? Maybe it's regenerative tech. I don't know.
What I'm hearing there is that you're interested in blockchain technology so far as it is in service of those greater aims, those greater purposes. And if it turns out that it's not, or if it turns out there's other technology which is actually more suitable for achieving those aims, then that's the technology we should be focusing on instead. Am I understanding that right?
Absolutely. And I will be frank that a big part of why it made sense to launch DreamDAO with a mission statement so tied to blockchain and cryptocurrency, where we're empowering Gen Z to learn how to use Web3 with that explicit understanding of it being blockchain and cryptocurrency. Um, so empowering Gen Z to learn how to leverage it to do good in the world is because there at least used to be as recently as a few months ago, a lot of money in the quote unquote Web3 space. And so a question to me that I'm exploring is like, is it possible to create a sustainable ecosystem of like finances and impact, that isn't built on bubbles and hype that pop as extremely as they do in the cryptocurrency space?
I would suggest that we've been, I mean, understandably, like a little bit down on blockchain technology, given this current moment we find ourselves in, where it's been a very eventful few weeks since the collapse of Terra. Um, but uh, for me, this core idea of decentralization and sovereignty are they're really worthwhile ideas,
Yeah.
and even as the the bubble pops, and it
Yeah.
actually there isn't nearly as much money just washing around to kind of pull into these regen projects. I have some sense that those principles of decentralization and sovereignty are still valuable to try to to learn from at least, and probably to kind of bake into this regenerative tech or regenerative movements that we might still hope to see.
Yep. And so a very open question to me, um, is what is the full scope of technologies that can be helpful for sovereignty, um, supporting agency, sovereignty of the individual and the community level, and maybe even city level, state level. It's almost certainly a mixture of different technologies. And I guess one thing that pops in my mind is like funding, right? I think we study the usefulness of technologies that the funders want to study the usefulness of, right? And
Mm-hmm.
claim the usefulness of. And I'm not meaning to say that there isn't going to be tons of practical applications that are essential and additive, greatly additive to various dimensions of human flourishing that we seek. Um, I think this kind of moment in time is a really good opportunity for us to think deeply about how to be a servant of humanity, where I think part of that is being very open minded to new technologies and what new possibilities that open up,
Mm-hmm.
but also um, for other technologies or older technologies, how might we have not just been creative enough or applied them enough, or maybe they've been applied in certain parts of the world and that we don't know of, and
Yeah.
in interesting ways.
So something that I know that you've been spending some time thinking about recently is the hyperlocal or change at the local level. And um, I'm wondering if we could talk a bit about that and even actually change that um, might feel necessary at different scales, at the level of the individual, the local, the state level, and but let's start with the hyper local. So uh, before this, we jumped on the call. We were speaking about libraries and civic space and the role that civic space could play in creating this solarpunk future, this regen future. So what are your thoughts on that? Where are you at with the role of civic space?
Yeah, so our pre-conversation was really good. We talked a lot about how technology can be useful for people that may not understand the technology, right? How can it be useful for your neighbors? Um, how can how can we use or repurpose existing spaces to convene community, right? So that and like almost instantiate it through convening in meaningful ways. How can we encourage people to get together, get to know each other, practice civic agency, where they think about what do they want to do together, and then they do it, and then they break bread together, and then they have fun, and then they reflect, and they decide, hey, do we want to do something else again? I I say this as knowing that I know very little about what's happening. I mean, this is kind of the point of me being self-aware. I say this as someone that not knowing if this is already happening, but if it is happening, I've heard nothing of it. Where people my age are gathering together as civic agents to maybe work intergenerationally, or even just in our generation, millennials or younger, to form a sense of fraternity uh, about building a better future for that local area or beyond. It's so foreign to me. I'm gonna be honest. That might be my fault. But what's less foreign to me is what I see on social media all the time, which is like these like they're actually kind of global mimetic networks now, mimetic tribes, where there's kind of like this global left, and there's multiple lefts, global right, multiple rights, and everyone just saying words. We're just saying things that you're signaling some kind of virtue, in some kind of way, and I don't think I think we do not reflect enough on just how much hundreds, if not thousands, if not whatever, however many exposures to people signaling virtue versus doing something that 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 embodies collective agency, individual agency. Yeah, I don't think we think enough about what that does to your brain, about what
Mm.
it thinks is important.
I have some sense it can be kind of substituting almost that to be talking about doing good on social media can maybe make me sometimes feel like, oh, I've been doing good, but actually I've just been talking about doing good. And it's like actually that there's still all those actual tasks out there in the real world in my
Yeah.
community that haven't yet been done. But it's like almost like I've still gone to bed kind of happy that night because I think I've liked the right things and said the right stuff. So that kind of begs the question then of like how could we actually stimulate some movement for civic action, for people actually coming together, relating to one another as citizens to make a difference in their local areas. And another thing before the call you mentioned the possibility of gamifying civic action in some way. Uh, I also spoke of this concept of proof of regeneration. Like, what if people could actually be rewarded in some way um, through this coming together and through making an impact on their local area? Yeah. Something come up for you if I.
So what does it look like if it becomes almost like common sense that you will be socially recognized for engaging in constructive, almost like democracy at the smallest scale, but not voting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like outside of voting, right? I think we've been manipulated by political parties to think that voting is democracy,
Mm-hmm.
where democracy is the day-to-day practice of civic life, civic exercising a civic agency as individuals and as collectives. What if that was more well known, right? And what if there were ways for you to develop civic merit badges almost, right? That were rewards in themselves, but maybe got other rewards from people that were excited that you were doing those things.
It makes me wonder, like, if what kinds of activities, tasks, gatherings do we really have in mind here? Then you said okay, it's not voting or that like that isn't. You want to kind of de-emphasize that, and maybe there's like a lot of weight placed on that as being like the way to change things. But what other things do you have in mind here?
Well, isn't it funny that the point of voting is to theoretically is to vote in people that will make your neighborhood and life better.
Mm-hmm.
But like again, this might just be people like me for some reason. I draw a blank often when I think about like how would I make my neighborhood
Mm-hmm.
better, right? I can maybe come up with a couple examples,
Mm-hmm.
but like why do we expect our leaders to be much better than the ones that we have today if
Mm-hmm.
we can't articulate what we want them to do
Mm-hmm.
or we want them to help do?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I almost feel like government action is it's a supportive utility. It's a last resort if the people can't figure things out themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've outsourced our our flourishing, our livelihoods, to kind of faceless entities like corporations, like you said, we're consumers that
Mhm.
are like, every pain that we feel, we can eat something and it goes away, or we wear some kind of VR headset that like drowns the
Mhm.
pain, distracts us from the pain of not feeling fulfilled, or instead of, and of course, a lot of people need help, but we rely on government for monetary support.
Mhm.
And I think success is people becoming more and more self-sufficient, and relying on civic communities over
Mhm.
the government. But again, how do you decrease dependence on government? You develop collective agency, collective ability to kind of manifest a better future for your neighborhoods. But if you don't think about what better looks like, which
Yeah.
again, I'm gonna raise my hand as like someone that is guilty of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So first, what I think I'm hearing is not so much that you're kind of like anti-government. It's just that you're like pro-citizen, or at least you're certainly kind of.
yes, thank you.
you're,
Wow,
it's
thank
like
you for thank you for
you're just interested in the potential for people to come together as citizens rather than consumers to create better neighborhoods
yes,
and better lives for themselves. And I'm also hearing that uh, it's hard for you and for me actually. It's hard in some ways to imagine that what like better communities
yeah,
could look like, which makes me think of the work of our dear friend Phoebe, who's very interested in talking about imagining better futures. Another aspect
true.
that I'm interested in is it's just it's how people are coming together. um, it's uh, it, it feels to me that there can be enormous power of people like just creating things together in very participatory, non-hierarchical, horizontal ways. It's a skill that I think has been lost, unfortunately, to a great extent in society. That um, we just don't have as many opportunities, spaces to really work that co-creative muscle. And uh, I'm interested about how we could make more opportunities for people to come together to co-create in their local areas. And I kind of think like what exactly they're co-creating is kind of secondary to just the fact that people are coming together to do something together, uh, w- without anyone particularly being in charge is the important part to me. So to feel what it's like to have to like get on with other people, have to work with other people, um, and then experience the inevitable conflicts that will emerge, which is another really important piece for me. For me, is just people becoming more and more comfortable with conflict and seeing that it's not the end of the world. That there are very effective ways of moving through and beyond conflict and coming to helpful understandings on the other side of these conflicts. So, yeah, that's some of what's coming up for me as you're speaking. But this piece that this share you made around just finding it very difficult to imagine what change you would like to affect in your local communities is very interesting to me. And I imagine if you're feeling that way, there's probably a lot of other people that are feeling that way too.
Yeah, just like thinking about my own thinking, it just really doesn't come naturally, because you're sort of, I mean, I'm someone that I would say I'm very high on belief in the potential of humans, and what happens when we come together. But I'm like alarmed almost by how like much I've realized I've been conditioned to believe that my environment is like it's just like something that you can't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not like that I propositionally believe that the environment can't change. Like it's reflected in how it's not obvious how things could be better, and I'm not saying that things are great either.
Mm-hmm.
It's, again, we have just outsourced this. What could be more important than practicing making things better
Mm-hmm.
for not just your, tiny tribe, across whatever line of difference.
Let me drop a few possibilities in of ways in which people might be able to impact their local area then, and just see how they land with you. So there's food, energy, and connectivity with three that came to mind, and three which Phoebe and I taught a bit about in the Tools for the Regenerative Renaissance course. So yeah, local food growing schemes, encouraging people to come together in neighborhoods to produce their own fresh, healthy food. Local energy generation schemes. There's actually a super interesting scheme in Brooklyn, in New York, where residents uh, own solar panels on top of apartment blocks and then share the energy
Where is
from
this?
with one another. In Brooklyn, in New York, it's called the Brooklyn microgrid.
Hmm.
And uh, and connectivity as well. Actually, I think it's also in New York. There's a project where people are sharing internet connections, so they just pay for one very fast internet connection, and then otherwise beam that signal around to various different apartment blocks. So lots and lots of people are just paying just for one connection rather than like hundreds and hundreds of people each paying for their own lines. So um, there's some of the things which like I'm interested in and excited about, and yeah, as far as I can see, some of this stuff is happening, and actually is interesting to me, like how it's not so well known about. These kinds of projects seem quite niche a lot of the time, and uh, I would love to see examples like those and others more widely spoken about, and maybe none of those three are appropriate in a given neighborhood, but maybe there's something else, and just to start talking about them perhaps stimulates the imagination a little, doesn't it? So is that the kind of thing that you're imagining, or is there something different coming up as I speak?
So I'm writing this down because I really like those: food, energy, connectivity, and connectivity. Sorry, can you repeat what the example was?
So let me. So it is called uh, NYC Mesh. This is a community-owned mesh network
Oh,
where
right. Part of it.
where people across New York City have free internet, or essentially free internet, because
Yeah,
many people are just paying for one line.
amazing. Um, yeah, I think stimulating the imagination is so key, because I think what this is making me think of is we need like frameworks for thinking about how to make cities better, like
Mm-hmm.
what kind of categories of ways, like you said, and then specific examples that fall under these categories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can imagine that like someone in Philadelphia like sees the mesh network in New York City and is like, let's um, do something very similar
Mm-hmm.
because it's possible.
Yeah.
And there's good storytelling around it.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to the idea that Web3, as we've known it, kind of, or speaking of blockchain technology, has drawn a lot of the light these past years, and I think some interesting stuff has come out of it. More interesting stuff will come out of it. But for sure there are other interesting aspects of solarpunk tech, we could call it, kind of like regen tech, like civic tech, which are really fundamental. Like if like what use is a local currency running on a blockchain if actually you don't have sufficient like food and energy and connectivity in that local area. So uh, I would love to see a kind of reorientation of Web3 technologies towards these uh, satisfying these fundamental and very tangible needs. I think that could be an interesting direction to head over the next years. And I think it's like pretty is at least compatible with Gitcoin's vision. Like Gitcoin talk about wanting to promote public goods, and they're starting with kind of Web3 software public goods, then hoping to expand to open source software more generally as another form of public good. But then my understanding is that they would happily expand to uh, public goods kind of outside of the software realm, which those could be examples of, like the public good of having just an abundant free food forest in your local community, or the public good of having community owned solar energy, or the public good of having like a shared wireless mesh network that anyone can access. So it's and of course we're early days, right? Like Gitcoin is still has that focus mostly on software, as it's just trying to figure things out to work out how both what are the fairest distribution mechanisms and also what are the sustainable funding mechanisms. But I'm excited for the point at which the public goods that Gitcoin is funding are not just software, but are these like extremely tangible things. We might be a couple of years away from that at this point, I think.
Yeah, and that's okay. I think it's okay if it's further out, if we just have a better expectation of when certain technologies will have that sort of real world impact, um, just so that we do not. I don't know. There's such a natural incentive to hype up something as being ready for to kind of immediately reach mass adoption and impact.
I mean, I think actually, you and I and certainly voices in Gen Z have a really important role to play. To say actually, um, like we don't want to wait. We don't want to have to wait for another 5 or 10 years before platforms like Gitcoin are funding those goods. Like what could we do to see like community energy and food and connectivity projects like in Gitcoin's like next funding round in like 3 or 6 months time rather than in 5 or 10 years time. That's interesting to me.
Well, so yeah, I think there's already starting to. I think Oakland had is or has a local quadratic funding round. I don't know how it went. I didn't follow.
Uh-huh. Yes, I did see something about that.
But here's actually a thought that I had, and I wonder. I always like wonder like if fleeting thoughts I have are probably just shared by a lot of other people. Where I don't know, ether is a funny name, right? Like I wonder like how my if my donations are just going to the ether, right? And I don't know, like we're funding a bunch of quote unquote global public goods, and and even the local public goods. It's like, why is it being matched in the same pool as global public goods?
Cool. I'm looking at the Oakland local grants page from Gitcoin now, and I don't think it is. I think it looks to me like there's $15,000 like of money specifically to match fund Oakland local projects.
Mm.
Um, And this is interesting. Yeah, I hadn't actually properly looked at this. I'm grateful that you brought my attention back to it. And I actually think this is a really important thing to fund. Like, I mean, I do think Oakland's great, but it's not so much that. It's just the example of. I think it'd be very powerful if we could show that these kinds of platforms and Web3 more generally is capable of directing funding and making like a meaningful difference to neighborhoods at the local or hyper local level. So I will be uh, putting some of my ether towards funding Oakland local projects, just to to boost that idea that this technology can be of use at that level.
Yeah, I'm trying to open it up right now, but yeah, this is it's really cool that they're doing this. I know the folks that are leading it. I don't know if my page is just not loading. How many grants are there? You said 15. Oh,
I just
there we
dropped a link in case
go.
you
Gotcha.
saw it.
Yeah, and so here's a very, and you don't have to have an answer to this. Like, what can you do with $200? Is not nothing, but like, what can you do with $200? And like, do you think that it illustrates enough of a point?
Okay, but so the top fund, yeah, so the top funded grant I'm seeing here is there's $195 raised from 24 contributors, but they're
Right.
receiving
Okay, matching.
$800 of match funding, right? So and this
Right.
is and of course it's yeah, it really relies on, or for this to be interesting, it relies on there being sizable amounts of match funding having been put forwards. But I think
Right.
Gitcoin's argument is that match funders are more likely to come forwards if they are confident that the system for distributing those funds, which at this point is quadratic funding, is fair and secure and is actually really helping to ensure that the most important projects get funded. So yeah, I'm kind of sympathetic to that line of thinking, but
That's great.
yeah, it's just it's very exciting that Oakland are here. Actually, I think, and like, can we imagine that in the future, like one of the main things you're seeing when you go onto Gitcoin's grants is not different blockchains as you see now and currently see. I can click on Aurora or Polygon or Celo or whatever, but instead it's like a map of like different communities that have taken this step
Right.
to believing in the potential of Web3 technology as at least as a provably fair way of funding projects in their local areas, and I think that it sounds like that day is coming. If we're already seeing Oakland there, then surely there's a good chance that next time there'll be a dozen cities and then 100 and then 1,000 and so on. We can hope.
Yeah, I'm super grateful for Gitcoin. I think it's a shining star in the Web3 world, from its focus on really creating, empowering. It is an ecosystem of ecosystems. I was talking to Scott the other day about the grant rounds and how they're pretty frequent. They're like several times a year, and I was like, like, does it maybe make sense to do these when the market is good? And he was like, no, like, these rounds need to exist all the time, right? So that that people can rely on them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even be one of the rare things that in the Web3 space during these like up and down cycles that people can reliably rely on.
Yeah,
So
it's actually reminding me of a part of the conversation I had with my previous guest, Vince Horn, of Buddhist geeks. He was talking about an economy of giving, or dana is the Buddhist word for giving. And uh, it's so much of the Web3 space is focused on like number go up and growth of personal wealth. But what would it look like to actually have an economy of giving where our, our reputation, certainly our sense of like self-worth, was more defined by how much we had given away and what projects we had helped to bring into existence, rather than just like what the number is on our bank statement. And that might sounds like a big challenge, relative to where we are right now. But I believe there are examples of indigenous communities where this was integral. This was well known, where like the wealth of an individual was much more related to how much they'd given away rather than how much they had hoarded, as it is right now.
I mean, I love this, and I've thought about this a lot, and I there may not be a single number that replaces your bank account balance, right? But imagine if we were able to, in pretty high fidelity, have a map of our impact, um, across all the people that we've mentored, supported, projects that we built, and who was able to be employed by those projects. And I think people would be able to have people that are very service oriented would have a better self image of themselves if they were able to see what their impact was. Because right now, and this is funny as someone with aphantasia, where I don't have a mind's eye actually. Um, and so I'm not like I literally, cannot imagine my bank statement, or me sitting in a limo or something like that. But people, I'd say including me, just in different ways, are really influenced by images of what success look like. So it's it's kind of a futile exercise to just complain about how people what people view as success if you don't create an alternate vision of what success looks like. You can almost imagine you can imagine like different ways of visualizing your impact. Like one of them could be like a scrapbook of all the great gatherings that were able to be happen
Yeah.
because of your donations, because of your advisorship,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Right? Like just like all these smiling faces, right?
Yeah.
Like some kind of
Yeah.
scrapbook thing, or that tree impact like diagram that I'm talking about.
Yeah. And it reminds you of another strand of work that Gitcoin are doing around impact DAOs, right? Like I think they see defining like, well, what is an impact DAO, or like a project that has impact, and from there, I guess you can then, at least in the blockchain space, like it will be transparent of who has actually given funds, donated funds to those projects, and this idea of I can imagine this something like a kind of, yeah, an automatically generated like record of one's impact, at least so far as donations one's made, and probably also, if we're thinking of the Web3 space, events one's attended, meetings one's attended, if you're getting POAPs and things and so on, and resulting perhaps in some kind of impact score or impact scores according to
Yeah,
the activity of that
or
individual.
impact graph,
Mm-hmm.
or both. Yeah.
Hmm. and
Well,
and then it's for and then the question is, well, what what uses that? And mm, I'm tempted to say that it's mm, that then the people with those that people making impact will be having a better time, and if it can become known that people who are making an impact on the world, positive impacts on the world, are happier and healthier and are having the best parties, and and just like making the best and most interesting improvements to their neighborhoods, then that's the kind of thing that could motivate people to think, okay, actually that's the direction in which I want to improve my life. I don't want to improve the number of my bank balance number. I don't want to improve my Instagram follower account number, but the number I'm interested in improving is instead this something to do with the measure of positive impact I'm actually having on the world, for the real life opportunities that will unlock for me, for the friends that I'll make, and for the experiences that I'll be able to have, for the quality of locally grown food I'll be able to enjoy, and so on. So um, yeah, I think we're pretty much at time now, so I think we're going to have to wrap. But I feel like an interesting place to get to,
yeah.
and nice to actually tie up some of our conversation around the local with the Web3 space by using the Oakland funding round on Gitcoin as an example. So I'm certainly going to keep an eye on that. Gary, have you got any
Yeah.
final thoughts for us before we close?
I'll my final thoughts can be some questions like what does better look like for your local area, local neighborhood?
Mm.
Um, who are role models of civic agents, civic heroes, ordinary do-gooders, that should be role models in your area? Do you feel like you have influence over what happens in your surroundings? How does that make you feel? These are questions that I've been asking myself a lot lately, and it's why I'm spending a lot more time thinking about hyper local projects.
Mm.
And I really encourage anyone that is exploring this, has been exploring this, to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at Gary Sheng, GarySheng. I think this bear market comes at a really good time because I think, at least for me, because I had spent a lot of time just investigating these like global regenerative quote unquote finance solutions, and I think global scale is really important, in a lot of cases. But what is that without the hyper local nodes that are flourishing
Mm.
and that increasingly rely less on and are just supported by uh, a variety of technologies, where it's like the local people are already in the process of making things better,
Mm.
and they just have this like menu of technologies
Mm.
that can help them achieve their goals.
Yeah.
The technologies are not imposing on them; they're
Mm.
additive. Anyways,
Mm.
Stephen, such a pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks for that beautiful final monologue there, and I'll certainly be including links to your Twitter and your other projects in the show notes. Gary, thank you very much. Speak to you again soon.
Thank you so much.